It took me almost 6 years from its release to experience The Last of Us. And during my entire playthrough, it never crossed my mind that I was playing a game from the previous generation. Of course, I was playing the remastered edition on PS4, but a graphical facelift aside, at its core, The Last of Us captivated me with its intriguing world design, engaging combat, and the gripping tale of a grief-stricken father, a broken man trying at all costs to protect humanity's last and only hope, a young girl named Ellie. Over the first game's roughly 15-hour story, it is hard not to become invested in the bond that grows between the two main characters, to the point that when it comes to the end of the game, Joel's inner conflict over allowing the Fireflies to create a cure to the Cordyceps virus from Ellie's immunity also becomes the player's inner conflict. We're told that Ellie will die from the procedure, but ultimately this will help save the lives of many more. And if Spock has taught us anything, it's that
the needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
However, we as humans, creatures with such complex emotional impulses, know that in the same situation, if asked to give up a loved one to help strangers you may never know, the line becomes increasingly blurred. Joel and Ellie will go down as two of gaming's most popular characters, forever remembered as a duo, just like Batman and Robin, or Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. So you can imagine the world's collective shock when Joel is violently murdered during the prologue of the sequel. The Last of Us Part 2 goes to very, very dark places during its roughly 25 to 30 hour story. Both Ellie and the player are naturally driven down the same revenge path to avenge Joel's death. And throughout Ellie's journey, it's very easy to blindly view every enemy and associate of Joel's killer to be inherently evil. I have to admit that in the first few hours, dealing out quote-unquote justice as Ellie to those who were involved felt right. As from the player's perspective, Joel was a caring father figure to her, whose one true sin was viewing Ellie as a daughter and not being able to see the bigger picture beyond if she had died on that operating table. Now there's a key word in there that I want to focus on, a word in which the entire game hinges upon: perspective. Because here's the thing, for a brief time before his death and for the second half of the game, you play through the perspective of Joel's murderer, Abby. Abby and her role in The Last of Us Part 2 will be discussed for years to come, discussed being the optimum word.
You're such a dick!
every day I wake up and I hope you're dead.
Her inclusion in this game has been a topic of great contention for the fanbase, some praising her addition and the bravery of Naughty Dog to pull such a bold move, whereas others downright hate her character to the point that the game has experienced review bombing, the developers have seen backlash, and even the actress who performed the motion capture and voice for Abby has received horrible messages and even death threats for simply doing her job as an actress. Don't get me wrong, people are totally within their rights to dislike a product and offer genuine critique, but this sort of behaviour is just unacceptable. But let's put a pin in that for a minute. How does The Last of Us Part 2 actually hold up as a game? In my own opinion, it's pretty great. The elements of the first game I enjoyed most are carried over to the sequel and improved upon. Perhaps not as expanded as some would like, but there are enough new mechanics such as the ability to dodge and go prone to expand the combat options. Visually, this game is a marvel. We're only months away from the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, and yet, even though I'm only showing footage from my PS4 Slim and not the Pro with its higher resolution capabilities, it's insane to believe that we will see further advancements on graphics like this. In only the first few moments of the game, as I turned this corner and the lens flare from the evening sun cascaded across the screen, I was transfixed. In tandem with the visuals, and just like the first game, the score by Gustavo Santaolalla beautifully enhances the atmosphere, and does so for the entire game, increasing in tension and urgency during combat and stripping back for more tender moments in the story. Just like in The Last of Us, exploration and combat make up the bulk of gameplay, with light environmental puzzles added in for good measure. The Last of Us Part 2's environments are much larger than before, and whilst the game still follows a linear structure, there now feels like the player has more options to choose how they get from A to B. In many instances during exploration, it's easy to spot multiple pathways to go down, so it's very likely that you won't see everything the game has to offer on the first playthrough. For example, during Ellie and Dina's first day in Seattle, you are free to roam a small number of city blocks. And in doing so, I came across an old music store. Find the guitar in the back room and you can trigger a cutscene where Ellie will play a more somber version of Aha's Take On Me.
Talking away. I don't know what I'm to say, I'll say.
Leading to a rather feel-good moment for herself and Dina. It wasn't until I watched Kinda Funny's spoiler cast with the game's director Neil Druckmann that I found out that this moment, along with many others, are completely missable if the player doesn't make the effort to seek out these areas.
I'll be coming for you, okay?
Further exploring these environments will also help the player to find ammo, scavenge items to use for crafting and upgrades, find supplements for ability upgrades, unlock safes using combinations found in the nearby area, or simply buy your own ears, as well as finding crafting tables to customize your weapons and make them better for combat scenarios. It was also in these moments where the level of detail from the animators really came into the forefront. What could have been a simple menu screen is instead a fully animated segment where the character on screen disassembles, crafts, cleans and reassembles their weapons before the player's eyes. Just watch your back in case this happens.
We're not going back, understand?
Traversal of these areas will require the player at certain points to solve an environmental puzzle in order to proceed. The variety and scope of these puzzles have seemingly varied since the first game. Most notably is the inclusion of rope-based puzzles, where careful placement of the swing point will determine whether or not you will succeed. Now these puzzles aren't uncharted levels of complexity, but there were one or two times where I was left scratching my head for a few minutes. One in particular that I enjoyed was when I came across a locked gate and needed to find a way in. Hopping the fence further down and entering this warehouse, I stumbled across a movable bin, which I knew I could place against the wall to hop over. However, I had to get the bin past this pulley operated door, which would close if ever Ellie let go. Eventually, I worked out that I had to use the warehouse ramp so that the bin could roll down and out whilst Ellie held the door open.
Come on. Yes. Actually worked.
The final section of gameplay is the combat. I absolutely love the combat in these games. The sheer brutality and grittiness to these encounters kept my heart racing from beginning to end whenever I was spotted. Unlike some action games where it feels you could stand out of cover and the AI still couldn't tell you apart from the bright red stop sign next to you, in The Last of Us Part 2 it is crucial that you stay mobile, you are always aware of your surroundings, and most importantly, that you are accurate with your shots, because these guys will put the pressure on quick. Similar to my comments in the Resident Evil video, you should check that video out too, by the way.
Do it.
Ammunition is scarce, and there were a few times in combat where I was without any ammo for all of my weapons. And this is where the adaptability of the combat system showed its strength. Even without ammo, you aren't helpless. Melee weapons can be found in the environment or picked up from dead enemies, and these allow for some truly gruesome up-close kills. These weapons do have a durability to them, so monitoring how many hits you have left before it breaks is important, though this can be prevented by upgrading the weapon with spare parts to replenish this allowance. You can also craft throwable items such as Molotov cocktails and smoke bombs, create trap mines, and craft certain ammo types such as arrows, explosive arrows, and incendiary bullets, if you have the right supplies in the heat of combat. All that being said, when you are packing heat, the gunplay feels great, and certain guns will open up enemies and remove limbs with a vengeance. Pair this with the realistic screams and callouts of your enemies to their fallen friends, and combat simply oozes with atmosphere and tension to make every moment a thrill. Naughty Dog have made a combat system that is almost cinematic in nature, without taking control away from the player. The seamless transitions between shooting into melee combat and the way Ellie picks up items on the move is staggeringly clean, thanks again to the great animation work. It also should be said that if you're good enough, bloodshed can be avoided thanks to the optional use of stealth. Stealth in The Last of Us Part 2 isn't reaching the levels of Splinter Cell or Metal Gear, with its diverse range of options and gadgets, but there is still a decent system in place to allow a certain freedom when sneaking around enemies. Different lengths of grass to crouch or crawl through, throwable brick and bottles to create noise away from your position, and an upgradable Arkham-esque vision which will reveal enemy positions, albeit in a more blurred state. Where a vision mode like this usually gives the player almost too much of a hunter advantage over the AI, The Last of Us Part 2 combats this with a new addition to these sections. Dogs can massively shake up stealth with the ability to detect and follow your scent, meaning camping in a corner until the AI conveniently walks by isn't such a reliable strategy anymore. These good boys are vicious and will force the player to keep moving through the environment whilst trying to maintain a covert approach. It was at this part in the script writing process when I realised that I haven't even mentioned the other enemy type you'll encounter in the game, the Infected. It wouldn't be The Last of Us without some fungi-infested zombies now, would it? Though that being said, maybe it was just me, but it seemed like in comparison to the first game, the Infected took much more of a backseat this time around. It felt like The Last of Us Part 2 wanted to focus more on the conflicts of the human factions, but that doesn't mean that the player wasn't treated to a few new additions to the Infected lineup. Shamblers that disperse deadly spores when in contact with the player, Stalkers that quietly lurk in the shadows and are not detectable in the listen mode, and the Rat King, which I just don't want to ruin for anybody despite having already discussed spoilers in the game. That thing could give anything in the Resident Evil series a run for its money.
Yeah, I feel pretty sorry for the next guy who looks at me funny.
What about that guy?
Clickers are still as creepy as they were before, and runners can also prove a tough foe when in numbers. Whilst usually encountered separate from each other, there are combat areas where both human and infected enemies are present, and this can make things even more difficult when trying to dispatch enemies without being caught. Or if you're like me, you can take advantage of this perfect cocktail of chaos, and as Ken Watanabe best put it,
Let them fight.
this game is also hard, man. Nowadays I usually play games on hard difficulty for the challenge, but for some reason I settled on medium for my first playthrough of The Last of Us Part 2. And boy am I glad I did. The AI isn't forgiving and puts up a fight from start to finish. This isn't to say it's the smartest AI out there. I had a few moments where multiple enemies would follow their buddies to the same death, despite just witnessing Lee shoot their pal James in the face moments before. But it's aggressive enough to really push the survival at all costs atmosphere. Side note, I also just want to say how much I really love the idea that the Scars faction communicate through whistles. It's so creepy. And it makes fighting them more difficult as you can't understand what is being said between members as they look for you. It's brilliant. At this point, I honestly thought I'd have more to discuss on the story. Everyone's got their own interpretation, and to be honest, I don't think I've fully formed mine yet. It's always changing under new information and after hearing the opinions of others. Ellie's story followed a somewhat predictable path of revenge consuming the individual until they become nothing but a cold, hollow shell of their former selves. But this did allow for a lot of thrilling and intense moments along her journey.
Yeah. You remember me.
Unpopular opinion, but I found myself to genuinely care for Abby by the end of the game. The reveal that Joel was the man who killed her father, the surgeon in charge of Ellie's operation, and thereby kickstarting Abby's path of revenge, is the moment when the game holds up a mirror to the player and asks, well, wouldn't you do the same? For me at least, it was hard to justify Ellie's lust for revenge without being able to do the same for Abby's. As I spent more time with Abby, and especially after befriending Yara and Lev, in what I have to mention is maybe one of the coolest sections of the game. Nothing like a bare-knuckle fight to survive in the pitch black with only a fire to illuminate your surroundings, leading to a chase through the forest, a one-on-one fight to the death with a mallet-wielding Miss Trunchbull, and capping off with a tense holdout against runners and clickers as you desperately wait for an exit to be revealed. Anyway, where was I again? Oh yeah. As I spent more time with Abby, Yara and Lev and witnessed their bond grow, I wanted to see these characters succeed, make a new life for themselves and leave it all behind for something better. I can't say the actual ending is what I wanted. I can definitely say it's not what I expected. But one thing is for sure, when the credits rolled, I wasn't left with the same feeling of awe that I was after finishing the first game. It just seemed like I was left asking, was it all worth it? For the characters, I mean. I was pretty content blowing zombie heads off. I don't really know what I'm trying to say about this game. For me, The Last of Us will always hold the superior story, But in terms of sheer playability as a game, The Last of Us Part 2 delighted me at almost every turn, and ultimately that's all I could ask for. The game is well acted, well directed, the gameplay is intense and gripping, overall it's a technical marvel, and proof that Naughty Dog, for better or for worse, are one of the most talented game development studios in the business today. I'm excited to see what they have next up their sleeves. Thank you again for watching, guys. I know these videos don't get massive amount of views, but if you're one of the people that come back every episode, then I'm truly thankful that you spend a little bit of your day listening to me ramble over the things that I like. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.